What's going on, guys? This is VinylicPuma. Took me way longer than I wanted to get this video together for you guys, but today I wanted to talk a little bit more about the state of Fallouts and more specifically, the state of the Fallout lore. Before we start though, I did want to go ahead and mention my last video and how I was surprised at the reception of it. A lot of you guys seemed to get where I was coming from and liked a lot of what I had to say. And while there are those that did seem to be upset at some of what I had to say, I felt like I had to comment on this issue. Whether anyone wants to admit it or not, Fallout 76 has been mired in controversy since its announcement, much to the chagrin of both casual and hardcore fans, and maybe even Bethesda game studios themselves, if they're really being honest with us. After all, and at the end of the day, everyone just wants a good Fallout game that people enjoy. There's also the fact that speaking up yields results. If Reddit user Baffodil had never started his thread on the Brotherhood of Steel retcon, we would never have seen an official response from Bethesda themselves. While I intend to discuss this tweet from the official Fallout Twitter account later on in this video, I think Bethesda is to be applauded for trying to make this right with the fans. While some will complain about Fallout 76 spoilers and an attempt to label instigators of this controversy as Fallout 76 haters, lore nerds, pedants, traditionalists, or whatever other derogatory names somebody can think up, it ultimately all goes back to the controversy that surrounds Fallout 76. People are upset with and skeptical of this game, and seeing or hearing that your favorite faction was possibly retconned in a seemingly illogical way is cause for outcry. If Bethesda takes anything away from this whole situation, it should be that people do in fact care about the Fallout lore, and great care should be taken to protect and preserve its integrity. This isn't to say stories can't ever be changed, as removing Fallout Brotherhood of Steel from the canon was a great idea. However, changing things that don't need to be changed or not going that extra mile and paying attention to the finer details does risk pissing people off. This brings me to what I want to talk about today, and that is what I consider to be Bethesda's lore problem when it comes to Fallout. While there is evidence of Bethesda changing the lore in Fallout 3, I want to focus a lot more on the bizarre and seemingly aloof changes that Bethesda made to the Fallout lore, with Fallout 4 in particular. The fact is, the Fallout 76 Brotherhood Retcon controversy is just another in a series of bizarre changes that Bethesda have made that caused a community uproar. As a great example, a common retcon that a lot of people complain about involves the chem Jet. If you're familiar with the lore, Jet was created by Myron in Fallout 2 and appears in the later games on both the East and West Coast, presumably due to people replicating Myron's formula. However, if you've played Fallout 4 and you've visited the Vault-Tec Regional HQ, you'll find a log entry that specifically says, and I quote, "So we just shipped 15 cases of Psycho and Jet to Vault 95. Of course, that makes total sense. Let's give these addicts more of what put them in this situation to begin with. Davidson says it's to force them to make the hard choice. Chems are getting clean. I say it's to cause a bloodbath." Obviously, this terminal entry was composed pre-war and would suggest that Jet, which was originally created by Myron in Fallout 2, is in fact pre-war, basically retconning what was established in a previous game that was likely upheld by the developers of both Fallout 3 and New Vegas. Now, while I'm sure someone can explain this retcon away by saying that Myron mentions he made Jet from a pre-war protein extract that, with the slightest bit of contamination, creates this amphetamine that replicates the effects of Jet, and I guess by extension you could say someone somewhere in the pre-war period knew how to make Jet, I would like you to answer two questions for me. Number one, how did anyone from the pre-war period in the Fallout universe know to name it Jet before Myron did? And number two, how does making Jet a pre-war chem improve and or enhance the Fallout story? The latter question I think is more poignant and important because a good argument could be made that Fallout 4 is still fun despite the fact that they retconned Jet. However, did retconning Jet improve Fallout 4's story or Fallout 4 as a whole? If you really sit down and think about it, the answer is no. If anything, it actually makes the game worse because it contradicts what we've seen in previous games. And if you're someone that has played or has invested a lot of time in this series, it lowers your appreciation of Fallout 4 and the series as a whole. But let's move on to another bizarre change from Fallout 4 that people complain about. If you've played Fallout 2, then you'll recognize the Enclave's armor that appears throughout the game and appears on the game's cover. This armor appears once again in Fallout New Vegas and is called the Remnant's Power Armor in the game, and this armor appears once again in Fallout 4 under the X01 designation. Now, some are quick to point out that X01 and the Enclave armor from Fallout 2 and New Vegas are different. And to an extent, I would agree, because if you look at the helmets on both the Remnant's armor helmet from New Vegas and the X01 helmet from Fallout 4, they are slightly different. The New Vegas one has a design that looks like it's missing a filter on one side, while Fallout 4's has two filters that are coming out of both sides of the helmet. Not to mention that the mouth region of both helmets looks a little bit different as well when you compare the two. However, a key factor that is worth pointing out is Fallout 4's X01 armor loading screen, which reads as follows. The X01 series of power armor was specially engineered and employed by remnants of the US military after the Great War and offers increased protection over the older pre-war models. Based on this loading screen, I think it could be argued that the two are the same armor, however both have different designs due to the redesigns of power armor. After all, power armor is very different in Fallout 4 compared to the previous games, and even legacy armors like the T-45 and T-51 underwent some redesigns for Fallout 4. So despite the differences in appearance, both should be the same armor since Bethesda has a loading screen that seems to suggest as much. However, if you've played Fallout 4's Nuka World DLC, you can come across a suit of X01 in a pre-war display case in the Galactic Zone area. To answer why this is in the game, you get a line in a terminal in the Brad Burton offices that says, quote, "We even used the Quantum to enhance one of the military's power armor suits," which implies that X01 was developed by the US military before the Great War and is actually a pre-war armor rather than a post-war one. Now, what's interesting about this retcon is that it seems Bethesda intended to adhere to previously established lore from earlier games, yet for whatever reason, they decided not to adhere to previously established lore and decided to retcon what is arguably one of the most iconic armor sets in the entire series that's really only second to the T-51. Now, a good argument could be made that the Nuka World Quantum X01 retcon was justified because it improved how the Nuka World DLC played. And I do have to agree that from a gameplay perspective, it makes more sense to allow the player to get the best armor in the game rather than give you a set of Quantum T60 which has less prestige. At the same time, what was stopping Bethesda from creating an entirely new armor or making a couple of visual tweaks to an existing armor that was already established as pre-war and give it the stats of the Quantum X01? If they had done that, it would have made more sense in the context of the greater Fallout story, and the amount of resources it would have cost Bethesda could have been minimal. Especially if they just modified the design of the T60 ever so slightly and stuck it in the Galactic Zone display case. While what's done is done, I think we can all agree that if Bethesda had put forward a little more effort into trying to preserve and protect the integrity of the Fallout lore in this instance, fans would have been happier. It's true that the devil is in the details, and while it can be frustrating and time-consuming to be so thorough, the product that results is worth it. Going the extra mile in this case would have appeased fans and could have resulted in something that was a lot more interesting. Especially if what was in the Galactic Zone display case looked like an interesting cross between T60 and X01 armor. Now, the reason I brought up both of these Fallout 4 retcons is because both of these changes were honestly unnecessary and only ended up upsetting people that were either heavily invested in the lore or had been invested in the Fallout series long term. I would argue that both could have easily been prevented by either rewording a terminal entry in the case of Jet, or taking the time to make modifications to an old asset, or to make a new asset in the case of the X01 armor. I also think both retcons are useful in describing my opinions on the official Fallout Twitter account's tweet in response to this whole Brotherhood of Steel retcon controversy. In case you didn't get a good look at that tweet earlier, this is what the tweet says. November 2077, a month after the Great War, Army Captain Roger Maxson arrived with survivors at the Californian bunker of Lost Hills. There he formed the Brotherhood of Steel, who used a functioning satellite to extend their reach across America, all the way to Appalachia. Now, it's worth mentioning that the first sentence actually parallels what is said in the Fallout Bible that was written by Chris Avellone. While it's disputed whether the Fallout Bible is canon or not, I do think it is wise on Bethesda's part to reference the Fallout Bible, as many consider it to be canon, or at the very least, it's used by fans to help explain some of the backstory that Bethesda has not yet explained in official material. I also think the cries that the Fallout Bible isn't canon and thus there isn't any Brotherhood lore between 2077 and 2161 are silly when Bethesda themselves reference material Chris Avellone wrote that's not supposed to be canon. That, and there's more about that argument that I will debunk later on in this video. The second sentence tells us how the Brotherhood is in Fallout 76, and while I'm skeptical that the Brotherhood would contact the outside world based on how they're described as isolationists in the Fallout Bible, and I also have concerns because of how the Brotherhood appears in T60 armor in this tweet, which is something that the East Coast Brotherhood supposedly acquired between the events of Fallout 3 and 4, maybe all of this will be explained in Fallout 76. What I think we can say for sure is that, sort of like the Exo-1 retcon, this whole situation could have been avoided if Bethesda had simply created a new faction for Fallout 76, rather than using a pre-existing faction that is generally accepted to have not have been in the East Coast until the events of Fallout 3. I hold the opinion that if Bethesda simply included a wiped-out faction of survivors that were contacted by the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 76 and that was logged on some kind of terminal or something, that would have been better than including the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 76. Plus, and like I mentioned earlier with Fallout 4's retcon to Jet, does having the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 76 improve the greater Fallout story? Especially when you could have had another faction that made more sense for the time period. Now, at this point in the video, we should talk about Bethesda's artistic license when it comes to the Fallout series. After all, I'm sure there are plenty of people that will watch this video and will be quick to point out that it doesn't matter what I think and that Bethesda are the masters of the Fallout lore and whatever they say goes. There's also the fact that Fallout 4 is the highest-selling Fallout game ever made, and Fallout 3 vastly outsold its prequels that were made by Interplay, and thus, Bethesda has a better idea of what to do with the Fallout series than I or anyone else does. While I do agree that Bethesda owns the Fallout IP, they are the current writers of the series, and I will acknowledge that Bethesda has brought the Fallout franchise to incredible new heights of popularity. I also think it's an incredibly foolish and ignorant viewpoint to think that Bethesda are the masters of the Fallout lore when Bethesda themselves have never taken or claimed ownership of it. For those of you that are understandably confused or even upset by what I just said, let me explain. Much of our understanding of the Fallout lore is actually compiled by enthusiastic fans of the Fallout series on various wikis. As a great example, if you look at the Fallout timeline on the Fallout Wiki, you'll realize that much of that timeline is compiled from the Fallout Bible, as well as any dates that are mentioned in any of the Fallout games that have been released so far. This is important to point out because Bethesda themselves have never created an official timeline that reflects their vision for what the world of Fallout should be. Fans are the ones that have had to do that for them. It's also worth pointing out that many important aspects or facets of the Fallout lore that were documented by the fans ultimately ended up in the official games by Bethesda. Case in point, if you read this old GameFAQs article where they are interviewing Pawel Demowski, who is the guy that created the Fallout Wiki, he says as follows. Yes, and it's actually evident from some in-game content. One funny example is one of the terminals in the Citadel in Fallout 3 detailing the history of the Maxon family, the leaders of the Brotherhood of Steel. There are entries for Roger Maxon, the founder of the Brotherhood of Steel, his son Maxon II, and his grandson John Maxon. The thing is, Maxon II was what I called the guy in the vault because there was no canonical first name given for him anywhere in the games. Instead of giving him an actual name, the devs simply copied the name of the article, Maxon II, assuming that it's canon. Now, if you take the time to actually check out the Citadel terminals in Fallout 3, there is a Maxon II entry which references the dates of 2135 and 2155. These correspond to the year when Roger Maxon's son, aka Maxon II, took command of the Brotherhood of Steel and the year he died respectively. Fun fact, this is also reflected in the Fallout Bible by Chris Avallone, as the same dates are mentioned and largely consist of the exact same information as what appears on the Citadel terminals in Fallout 3. Earlier on in this video, I mentioned there's no Brotherhood history between the years of 2077 and 2161 argument that some in the community have made to justify the Brotherhood of Steel's appearance in Fallout 76. The fact that Fallout 3 rips backstory from the Fallout Bible makes the foundation of that argument pretty shaky. I would take the appearance of Fallout Bible entries in official material as proof that the Fallout Bible is in fact canon. Bethesda is certainly able to change their minds on that, but I think it would be unwise to do so considering that they've endorsed this material as canon for so long. With all of this in mind, though, I think it's fair to say that Bethesda hasn't taken proper ownership of the Fallout lore, and this is the core of Bethesda's lore problem. I also think it's unbelievably misguided of people to think or say that no one can or should be able to complain when Bethesda makes seemingly aloof changes to the Fallout lore, especially when you consider that most of the Fallout lore is fan-compiled and ends up in the official games by Bethesda Game Studios. Despite what you might think, I am somebody that cares about Fallout and cares about the Fallout lore, and Bethesda doesn't have to listen to me. But I think it's important that Bethesda comes out at some time in the future and presents a newly compiled Fallout timeline of their own creation. We need something that is at least somewhat respectful of what the fans have compiled, while at the same time is a definitive source. That way, Bethesda avoids situations where the fanbase gets pissed when Bethesda randomly deviates from the lore that Bethesda never really took ownership of in the first place. I also think the same could be said of the rest of the Fallout lore as well. If Bethesda wants to make changes here and there, they certainly have that right. But I do think what they established needs to be more definitive, concrete, and strictly adhered to, and not subject to change with every brand new game in the series. At the end of the day, I think it's important to recognize that an official tweet from the Fallout Twitter account is a win for everyone involved. Whether you agree or not with what I've said in this video, this is a case where fans spoke up and we got an answer. It may not have been the answer we all wanted to hear, and I think it's certainly worthy of criticism, but I think if we continue to talk about these things, it's going to improve the Fallout franchise long term. I guess we'll see what happens, but otherwise guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. Obviously, this is another controversial Fallout video, and I'm sure somebody is probably pissed at what I had to say, so if you did like this video, it would mean a lot if you guys helped support this video. As always, if you liked what I had to say, feel free to leave a like, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload more videos, and as always, thank you all so much for supporting this channel, take care, and I'll see you all in the next one.